The FBI tracked Sammy Davis Jr. for decades. When his secret file was finally declassified, what investigators found inside shocked everyone who read it. It started with a single act of defiance. It was the summer of 1954, and Sammy Davis Jr. had just returned from a tour that had taken him through the American South. He was 30 years old, already one of the most talented performers in the country, already famous enough that his name meant something in rooms where being black in America still meant sitting at the back of the bus and drinking from different fountains and sleeping in motels that the white performers on the same bill would never have accepted. He had accepted all of it for years, because accepting it was the price of working, and working was the price of surviving, and surviving was what you did when you came from where Sammy came from. His father, Sam Sr., had taught him that the stage was the only place where the rules bent, that audiences who would cross the street to avoid you on a Tuesday would give you a standing ovation on a Wednesday night. You took the applause and you took the humiliation, and you kept moving, because stopping was not an option. But that summer, something inside Sammy Davis Jr. shifted in a way that could not be shifted back. He had watched a group of white musicians from the same touring company eat dinner at a restaurant that turned him and the other black performers away at the door. He had watched it and said nothing, the way he had said nothing 100 times before. And then he had gone back to his room in a boarding house 3 miles from the hotel where the rest of the band was staying, and he had sat on the edge of a narrow bed in a room that smelled like mildew and cigarettes. And he had made a decision. He was going to use his voice, not just for singing. That fall, Sammy began speaking publicly about racial discrimination in the entertainment industry in ways that entertainers of his era rarely did. He didn't jittle hints or make oblique references that could be walked back if the reaction became dangerous. He named specific hotels that refused to house black performers. He named specific clubs that would book black acts but wouldn't let them use the same entrance as white patrons. He said these things in interviews, from stages, to anyone who would listen. He also did something that, in the political climate of 1954, was even more explosive than speaking about race. He started associating openly with people the federal government had decided to watch. The early 1950s in America were defined by a particular kind of fear. Senator Joseph McCarthy had turned paranoia about communist infiltration into a political industry, and the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover had been building surveillance files on anyone whose activities or associations could be framed as potentially subversive. Artists, intellectuals, entertainers, and civil rights advocates were particularly targeted on the theory that people who challenged the existing social order were natural allies of America's enemies abroad. Sammy Davis Jr. challenged the existing social order every time he walked on stage. Every sold-out room, every standing ovation, every review that called him the most talented performer of his generation was evidence that a black man could succeed at the highest levels of an industry that had been telling itself and everyone else that this wasn't possible. That made him a person of interest. The FBI opened a file on Sammy Davis Jr. in 1954. The file would eventually grow to hundreds of pages, filled with surveillance reports, informant accounts, intercepted communications, and assessments of his political activities and associations that reveal as much about the paranoia and racism of the institution doing the watching as they do about the man being watched. What the agents assigned to monitor him found was not what they were looking for. They were looking for evidence of communist ties, of anti-American activities, of the kind of subversive political engagement that Hoover's FBI had defined as a threat to national security. What they found instead was a man who was deeply, almost defiantly, American in his values and his ambitions, even as he refused to accept the version of America that wanted to keep him in his designated place. The surveillance reports from the mid-1950s document his performances with odd specificity, describing the audiences, the set lists, the reactions of specific individuals in the crowd. FBI informants attended his shows and filed detailed accounts of what he said between songs, what political statements he made from the stage, what conversations he had with audience members in the lobby afterward. They documented his friendship with Harry Belafonte, who was also under surveillance, and who was considerably more politically outspoken than Sammy. They documented his connection to Paul Robeson, the legendary actor and singer, whose leftist politics had made him one of Hoover's primary targets. They documented his attendance at civil rights meetings and fundraisers, his donations to organizations the FBI had classified as potentially subversive, his willingness to lend his name and his presence to causes that made powerful white people uncomfortable. What they also documented, though without appearing to understand the significance of what they were recording, was the extraordinary specific courage it required for a performer in Sammy's position to do any of these things. He was not protected the way white liberal celebrities of the era were protected. He could not afford the luxury of political engagement as a lifestyle choice that might generate some controversy but ultimately wouldn't threaten his fundamental security. Every public statement he made, every organization he associated with, every fundraiser he attended was a calculated risk taken against a background of real professional and personal danger that the white agents filing surveillance reports on him could not fully comprehend because they had never had to comprehend it. The Kennedy period brought new complications. Sammy's complex relationship with the Kennedy political operation, including his delayed wedding at the campaign's implied request, and his exclusion from the inauguration celebration despite his significant campaign contributions, created a situation where he was simultaneously adjacent to political power and excluded from its protections. The FBI surveillance continued through the Kennedy years, the Johnson years, and into the Nixon administration, which brought its own particular hostility toward black public figures who refused to stay quiet about racial inequality. The Nixon-era documents in Sammy's file reveal something interesting that later historians would spend considerable time analyzing. Despite his complicated and sometimes criticized association with Nixon, including a famous photograph taken at the White House in 1973 that generated enormous controversy in black communities, Sammy never stopped being monitored by the federal security apparatus. The surveillance apparatus did not distinguish between performers it considered politically friendly and those it considered threatening. It simply watched. The hug heard round the world, as some commentators called the Nixon photograph, cost Sammy enormously in the communities that had supported him throughout his career. He was accused of betrayal, of selling out, of choosing proximity to power over solidarity with the people who had sustained him. The criticism was harsh, and some of it was fair. What got lost in the controversy, what the FBI files actually document clearly, even if they documented without intending to, is that Sammy's relationship with Nixon was never ideological. He genuinely believed, as he had always believed, that personal relationships could accomplish things that political opposition could not. He thought access to the president, any president, could be leveraged for causes he cared about. He was sometimes wrong about this, and the Nixon situation was the most spectacular example of how wrong he could be. But the FBI file on Sammy Davis Jr., which was released through Freedom of Information Act requests decades after his death, does not reveal a man who was a threat to American democracy or a communist agent or an anti-American subversive. It reveals a man who was famous enough and outspoken enough and connected enough to make powerful people nervous, in an era when making powerful people nervous could get your phone tapped and your mail read and your performances attended by federal agents who were trying to find something to use against you. What the file actually reveals, to anyone who reads it today, is the portrait of a man who was far more complex and far more courageous than the surveillance state that was watching him ever understood. He used his relationships with Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack to integrate Las Vegas hotels that had been racially segregated for decades. He used his visibility in white entertainment spaces to make arguments about equality that were heard in rooms where those arguments had never been heard before. He used his talent to force acknowledgement from an industry that wanted to benefit from his gifts while keeping him at arm's length from full belonging. The FBI was watching all of this and writing reports that framed his activities as potential threats, missing almost entirely the thing that was actually happening, which was one man using every tool available to him to slowly, persistently, often unsuccessfully, but never permanently, change the world he had been given into something closer to the world he believed was possible. When his file was finally made public, journalists who reviewed it noted repeatedly that the surveillance had found essentially nothing incriminating, nothing that justified the decades of monitoring and the resources devoted to watching him. What they found was someone who believed in an America that didn't yet fully exist, and who spent his career performing that belief for anyone who would watch. That turned out to be more dangerous to certain powerful people than anything the FBI had actually been looking for. Sammy Davis Jr. was tracked because he refused to be silent. He was watched because he was impossible to ignore. He was surveilled because the people doing the surveilling had correctly understood one thing, even if they had misunderstood almost everything else about him. He was someone who had the power to change what people believed was possible. And that, in any era, is the most threatening thing a person can be. The specific incident that had initially triggered the formal opening of Sammy's file involved something that would seem almost comically ordinary by the standards of genuine subversion. In September 1954, Sammy had given an interview to a Los Angeles newspaper in which he criticized the entertainment industry's practice of paying black performers less than white performers with comparable or lesser talent and box office draw. He named specific figures. He named specific venues. He did not soften the language. An FBI agent in the Los Angeles field office read the interview and flagged it. The notes in the file from this period described Sammy as someone who was using his public platform to make inflammatory statements about racial discrimination in the entertainment industry, and who had associations with known advocates of social change. These phrases, in the bureaucratic language of Hoover's FBI, were as close to accusation as the file's authors needed to get. They opened the file. They began watching. The watchers initially expected to find what they were looking for fairly quickly. The early 1950s surveillance apparatus had become efficient at finding connections between artists and political organizations that could be used to discredit or pressure them. The technique was straightforward. Map the associations, find the most politically radioactive ones, and use the threat of public exposure to encourage the target to either become an informant or simply become quieter. With Sammy, the technique ran into a problem. He was not quiet to begin with, and his associations, while politically inconvenient, were not secretly radical. He knew Harry Belafonte because they were both prominent black entertainers navigating the same industry. He attended civil rights fundraisers because he believed in the cause. He spoke to journalists about racial discrimination because it existed and because he had personally experienced it in ways that made silence feel like complicity. There was no secret to expose because he was not keeping one. This created an odd dynamic in the surveillance reports, which continued to arrive on schedule at FBI headquarters in Washington, while containing progressively less of the material that would have justified the surveillance in the first place. The agents watching Sammy were competent professionals doing their jobs within a system that had tasked them with finding threats. They watched a man who was not a threat in the way they had been sent to look for, and they kept watching because stopping required a decision that nobody in the bureaucratic chain was motivated to make. The file grew thicker with reports that documented his professional life in exhaustive detail. Performances reviewed, touring schedules tracked, business meetings attended by informants who took notes on conversations that turned out to involve booking fees and set lists rather than revolutionary plots. phone call summarized by agents who found themselves transcribing discussions about which hotels would accept the full Rat Pack lineup and which would require separate accommodations for the black members of the group. That last subject produced some of the most revealing passages in the entire file, not because it contained evidence of subversion, but because the agents reporting on it were documenting, in the dry bureaucratic language they had been trained to use, a form of institutional racism so normalized that it registered as background rather than foreground. The notes describing how Sammy could not stay at the same Las Vegas hotels as his Rat Pack colleagues are written with the same flat neutrality as notes about parking arrangements and catering orders. Nobody thought to flag this as something that might be relevant to understanding why the man under surveillance might have reasons to be angry. The Las Vegas situation deserves particular attention because it represents perhaps the clearest example of how Sammy's approach to racial discrimination differed from the approach that would have made the FBI's surveillance more straightforwardly justified. The obvious response to being forced to sleep in separate accommodations while white colleagues stayed in luxury hotels would have been protest, or public statements, or political organizing. Sammy did all of those things, but he also did something the FBI wasn't watching for. He negotiated. He used his personal relationships with hotel owners, his drawing power at the box office, his ability to guarantee sold-out houses, to change individual policies at individual hotels, one conversation at a time, with results that accumulated into something that looked, years later, like the integration of Las Vegas hospitality. The FBI file documents the conversations he had, but doesn't understand what they were doing. The agents saw a performer talking to hotel management about bookings. They were watching the slow dismantling of institutional segregation in one of America's most publicly visible entertainment venues. The Hoover FBI had a particular institutional difficulty with this kind of change. Its surveillance apparatus was built to find threats that fit certain recognizable categories: the communist agitator, the foreign agent, the radical organizer. It had no good category for the entertainer who changed things through personal relationship, through the leverage of his talent, through the patient accumulation of individual agreements that collectively transformed a system. Sammy was not fitting the categories. The file got thicker and the categories stayed empty. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 created a new complication for the surveillance operation. The legislation that Sammy had publicly supported and privately lobbied for, using his connections to political figures on both sides of the aisle, with the same pragmatic determination he brought to hotel negotiations, had become law. Some of what his file's authors had characterized as potentially subversive advocacy was now simply advocacy for federal law. The FBI continued watching, but the justifications required a degree of creative interpretation that created tensions even within the files themselves. The Martin Luther King assassination in April 1968 represents a turning point in how the FBI file can be read. The Bureau's relationship with Dr. King had been one of its most intensive and most disturbing surveillance operations, going far beyond passive monitoring into active attempts to destroy him. After the assassination, the records of this campaign became evidence of institutional failure and moral catastrophe rather than national security success. Sammy's file for this period documents his grief and his anger in ways that are almost painful to read, because the agents writing the reports are clearly watching a man in genuine distress and filing clinical summaries of what they observe. He attended memorial events. He made statements. He used his platform to argue that something essential had been destroyed. The surveillance reports describe all of this accurately, while understanding none of it. In the 1970s, as Freedom of Information Act requests began revealing the scope of the FBI's surveillance of civil rights figures and entertainers, Sammy was among those who learned that he had been watched for nearly 2 decades. His response was characteristically complicated. He was not surprised. He had long suspected. But seeing the actual documents, reading the actual reports, understanding the actual scope of what had been done, was different from suspecting. He spoke about it in interviews during this period with a combination of bitter humor and genuine philosophical perspective that revealed how thoroughly he had thought about the relationship between his public activities and the surveillance state's interest in them. "They were watching me because I was saying things that made them uncomfortable," he told one interviewer. "But the uncomfortable things I was saying were true. That's what they never understood. You can watch someone saying true things for as long as you want. The truth doesn't stop being true because someone's taking notes on it." The complete declassification and public release of Sammy's FBI file came years after his death in 1990, and the journalists and historians who examined it found a document that served as an inadvertent record of American history from a surveillance state's perspective. The file tracked, without understanding, the gradual transformation of the entertainment industry's racial practices. It recorded, without comprehending, the development of a man's political consciousness from the moment of private decision in a mildew-scented boarding house in the South, through decades of public advocacy that changed real things in the real world. The surveillance had found nothing that justified itself. What it had accidentally preserved was something valuable, a record of what it looked like to challenge a deeply entrenched system through the accumulation of personal courage, small negotiations, and the refusal to accept silence as the price of safety. Sammy Davis Jr. was tracked because he refused to be silent. He was watched because he was impossible to ignore. He was surveilled because the people doing the surveilling had correctly understood one thing, even if they had misunderstood almost everything else about him. He was someone who had the power to change what people believed was possible, and that, in any era, is the most threatening thing a person can be. If this incredible story of government surveillance, quiet courage, and what it costs to refuse to be silent in an era of political persecution moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this with anyone who needs to understand what real courage looks like when the stakes are highest, or anyone who thinks that speaking truth to power has always been easy or safe. Have you ever taken a stand that cost you something real? Let us know in the comments about the moments when doing the right thing required genuine courage. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more powerful true stories about the people who refuse to stay silent.